Have you ever stopped to think that some of humanity's most valuable stories were born from boring routine? Well, while today many chase novelties and distractions, in the past there were men who spent their days watching sheep eat, listening to the wind, and repeating the same gestures day after day. It seems insignificant, but it was in this silence that leaders, eternal metaphors, and even symbols of faith that have spanned centuries were born. And perhaps the most curious or even controversial thing is this: the simpler the pastor's life, the more profound his influence. A profession considered humble, even despised by cities, ended up becoming one of the world's greatest symbols of care and leadership. Paradoxical? Undoubtedly. After all, how could something so monotonous become so grand today? Amidst so much haste and noise, these stories carry a different invitation: to learn from those who had nothing but a staff, patience, and the silence of the hills. And it is in this contrast that the value lies, because perhaps it is precisely in the tedious that we find the greatest lessons. By the way, before we begin, comment below where you're watching from and what time it is. I want to know how far this story goes. He envisioned the early days of humanity, when life was still simple and humans needed only the basics: food, shelter, and safety. It was in this setting that sheep farming emerged, almost as a natural instinct. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, figures still familiar today, walked with their flocks through the arid lands, attentive to the movement of the wind and the distant sound of footsteps on the sand. There was no rush, just the calm, predictable routine of those who understood that survival was tied to those soft, woolly creatures. When we think of wealth today, many imagine cars, houses, or even stocks. But back then, great wealth was measured by the size of the flock. A man who owned hundreds of sheep was seen as prosperous, almost a leader in his community. And it's curious how this connects with today. Even today, many people measure value in quantities, whether social media followers or accumulated material goods. It seems that somehow we continue to count our modern sheep. The everyday scene of a patriarch guiding his animals is more vivid than it seems. The sound of bells hanging from the necks of some sheep echoed through the valley, a faint tinkling that served as a soundtrack to the day. The smell of wool mixed with dust and human sweat created a unique atmosphere, not pleasant, but familiar to those who lived in that environment. Today, one might find it uncomfortable. However, for them, it was synonymous with security, as the smell of fresh coffee on a cold morning is for us. These shepherds didn't just care for animals, they kept a tradition alive. Each step of the flock revealed a story of faith and perseverance. Abraham, for example, didn't just see rams and lambs, but a sign of promise and continuity for his descendant. If we think about it, each generation also leaves behind small flocks of values and habits that are passed on, like parents who today teach their children to study, respect, and dream. Life hasn't changed that much. We've just changed scenarios and tools. Another interesting detail is how the profession shaped character. The shepherd needed to be patient, observe carefully, and make quick decisions in case of danger. This attitude, in a way, prepared men like Jacob and David for much greater responsibility. And between us, it's not so different from what happens today. Those who learn early on to deal with small challenges, such as saving money or taking on household chores, are generally better prepared for greater responsibilities in adulthood. The origin of this practice, therefore, is not simply a matter of subsistence, but a reflection of how humans found meaning in seemingly banal routines. The act of tending sheep eventually became an exercise in discipline and purpose. And if in our modern world tasks seem less poetic, perhaps it's because we've forgotten to consider them with the same care. After all, what comes after the origin is even more curious, as the shepherd's social role revealed much more than simple humility. He walked among the flock, knowing that, in the eyes of many, his role was modest, almost invisible. The shepherd had no prestige in the cities, did not wear fine clothes, nor did he participate in major political decisions. But even so, his presence was indispensable. After all, without him, the flock would not survive, and without the flock, there would be a lack of wool, milk, and meat. It's curious to think how someone so simple silently sustained the life of an entire community. If today we talk about essential professions such as doctors, teachers, and farmers, back then the shepherd was exactly that, the foundation of survival. There were no grand stages to recognize their value, but every family knew, deep down, that they depended on these discrete men. It's similar to what happens when you turn on the faucet and the water simply runs. You hardly remember the person who worked to bring the water to your home, but your life depends on them. The daily routines of these shepherds were so repetitive that they often went unnoticed. They woke before dawn, herded their animals, and searched for pasture and water. There was no glamour, just routine. And yet, it was this routine that sustained the collective. In today's society, we see something similar in jobs like street cleaners or bus drivers. They rarely receive applause, but without it, the city simply doesn't function. The invisibility of the essential is a constant irony of humanity. Despite his modest social standing, the pastor carried with him an implicit respect. There was a silent recognition. Everyone knew no one wanted to take on that role, but everyone depended on the person who did. It's like that person who always organizes the details of an event but never appears in the photos. Without them, nothing would go as planned, and deep down, this generates a different kind of authority, almost subtle, but powerful. Interestingly, the shepherd's social role was also one of trust. He needed to be upright, as the flock often belonged to another owner. A corrupt man could sell animals in secret, and no one would immediately notice. Therefore, honesty was as valuable as the ability to guide the sheep. Today, when someone is placed in charge of someone else's assets, be it a company or even a friend's password, the same principle applies. Trust is the most valuable currency there is. This humble and essential role of the shepherd reveals a lesson that extends to our days. Those who sustain the whole are not always the ones who stand out, and although it may seem unfair, there is a kind of greatness hidden in those who remain steadfast in silence. Because another question soon arises: if the position was modest, why was the flock itself considered such a great wealth? In those ancient times, owning sheep was not only a matter of survival, but also a symbol of power and prosperity. The size of the flock spoke volumes about its owner. A man with just a few sheep was seen as simple, perhaps even struggling, but someone who guided hundreds of them through the valleys was considered a true lord, someone who had earned respect and influence. Wealth, after all, was measured not in coins, but in wool, milk, and meat. The curious thing is how this way of measuring value resonates to this day. Think about the numbers people carry around with them, how many followers they have on social media, how many properties they own, how many diplomas they have on their wall. The logic is the same. Quantity is synonymous with importance. Only, back then, there were no likes or virtual applause. What mattered was seeing the herd occupying the plain like a moving white sea. This image, in itself, was a demonstration of greatness. Sheep represented not only status but also security. The larger the flock, the more secure a family's future. It was like having a savings account that was always yielding, only alive and in constant flux. Those who owned sheep had guaranteed food, wool for clothing, and even currency to acquire other goods. Today, we could compare this to having diversified investments, stocks, real estate, even reserves in different currencies. The logic of security remains the same, but it wasn't just about money or survival. There was something emotional too. A shepherd knew his sheep by the way they walked, by the sound they made when they bleated. And within this wealth, there was also the value of relationship. It's like someone who now owns a company and sees not just numbers on a spreadsheet, but people with different faces, stories, and personalities. Real wealth is never purely material. It always carries a human side. Of course, this abundance also brought challenges. The more sheep, the greater the need for land, water, and protection. A large flock attracted the attention not only of envious neighbors, but also of predators. Wealth attracted risk, and this is a lesson that spans the centuries. The more one achieves, the greater the effort to maintain it. Today, anyone who achieves rapid success knows the burden of maintaining it in the face of crises, pressure, and envy. Thus, sheep seen as wealth revealed a paradoxical truth. The more someone had, the more responsibility fell on their shoulders. And this leads us to consider not only the value of the flock, but also the landscape in which it moved. After all, what was it like to deal with those arid lands, full of contrast between scarcity and abundance? The shepherd's life was inseparable from the landscape he walked through. Imagine waking up and opening your eyes to see before you an immensity of arid lands, dotted with rocks and hills stretch as far as the eye could see. The sun rose slowly, painting the sky orange, but also bringing the promise of intense heat that would punish the body throughout the day. This harsh environment shaped not only the flock's steps, but also the endurance of the man who led them. The seasons weren't as mild as we're used to today, with air conditioning regulating the temperature or specific clothing for each climate. In the summer, the heat was scorching, dust kicked up in the wind, and shade became a rare refuge. In the winter, the nights were cold, and the shepherd had to wrap himself in heavy cloaks to avoid being overcome by the icy wind. This alternation was part of the routine, a constant reminder that life was fragile in the face of the force of nature. The terrain also influenced every decision. Leading the flock over rocky hills required patience and keen eyes, as a fall could be fatal for a sheep. The plains, on the other hand, offered more ample pasture, but they were also exposed terrain where predators were more likely to attack. Today, we consider similar choices when deciding where to live or work. Safety, comfort, and opportunities always come into play, just as the shepherd evaluated his trails. Interestingly, the environment even shaped the mind. Spending hours gazing at the empty horizon, listening only to the wind and the sheep's bells, gave the shepherd a different sensitivity. He learned to perceive almost invisible signs, the smell of dry grass before a drought, the low flight of birds announcing rain, or the eerie silence that preceded the approach of a predator. This heightened instinct is similar to what we feel today when we notice small signs in our lives, like a friendship growing cold, or a business deal beginning to hint at trouble. Seasonal pastures were a crucial detail. Food wasn't always available in the same place, so the shepherd had to lead the flock on long walks in search of new pastures. It was a nomadic job, one of constant adaptation. Today, we experience something similar when we change jobs, cities, or even habits.
always in search of better pasture. The cycle of change has always been a part of human life. This harsh landscape, marked by extremes, not only challenged the body, but also strengthened the spirit. The climate and terrain were silent teachers, instilling resilience and adaptation. But faced with such a hostile environment, there was one thing that accompanied the shepherd every day: his simple clothing, carefully chosen to withstand both heat and cold. The shepherd's clothing was chosen not out of vanity, but out of necessity. Early in the morning, when the cold wind still cut through the valley, he wore a rough woolen tunic, capable of protecting against the dry weather, yet light enough for long walks. Over his shoulders was a heavy cloak that at dusk transformed into a blanket. There was no luxury in his appearance, only functionality. Each garment had a clear purpose: to withstand the changing weather. It's curious to think about this today, when fashion dictates trends and many choose clothes more to impress than to. While today, a jacket can be worn to make a statement, back then a cloak was literally the difference between enduring a freezing night or getting sick. And if we look closely, we still carry this dilemma: dressing to show the world something, or to serve the body. The difference is that the shepherd had no choice. Survival was the deciding factor. The staff, always in his hand, was more than just a piece of wood. It was an extension of his body, an indispensable tool for guiding the flock, warding off predators, and even rescuing a sheep that had fallen into a crevice. Today, we could compare this object to a modern cell phone, always at hand, used for multiple functions. Difficult to imagine life without it. It's impressive how, in each era, a simple object can become central to someone's life. Beyond practicality, the clothes also carried a certain symbolism. The simple tunic told the world who he was: a humble man, connected to the land, far from the riches of the cities. And paradoxically, this humility was also a sign of dignity. It was like someone who today chooses to live a minimalist life, without ostentation, but finding value in simplicity. Often what he lacks in appearance, he makes up for in essence. Another interesting detail is that the garments accompanied the shepherd at all times of the day. In the morning, they protected him from the wind. In the afternoon, they defied the heat. At night, they became a makeshift bed. Each fold of the wool retained dust, the smell of smoke from the fire, and even the marks of the path. It was like a silent diary, recording everything without writing a word.
Today, perhaps we do the same with a worn pair of sneakers or a backpack that has accompanied us for years, carrying invisible memories. Thus, the clothes and staff were more than just utilities. They were companions on the journey, almost part of the shepherd's body. But if the clothes protected him and the staff helped him, there was another, equally vital question. How exactly did he use this tool in his daily life, transforming wood into a symbol of leadership? The shepherd's staff wasn't just a curved piece of wood, it was almost an extension of his own arm. He walked with it, leaning firmly on it, as if each step was more secure thanks to that simple object. As he guided the flock, he used the staff to indicate the way, tapping it gently on the ground or raising it as a visible signal. To the sheep, that gesture represented direction. To the shepherd, it represented silent authority. But it wasn't just about guide. The staff was also a weapon of defense. When a wolf or jackal approached, the shepherd would use the tip to intimidate and even strike if necessary. Imagine the scene: alone in the field, just him and the animals, and suddenly the shadow of a predator moves on the horizon. In that moment, the staff became the thin line between life and death. Today we have alarms, cameras, and fences. He had only a piece of wood, and surprisingly, it was enough. There was also the curved tip, used to rescue sheep that strayed too far and fell into crevices or difficult terrain. The shepherd would hook the hook around the sheep's neck or belly and pull it back like someone rescuing someone from drowning. This simple image holds a powerful metaphor. How many times in life does someone pull us back when we're about to make bad choices? A friend, a piece of advice, even a bitter experience can be our invisible staff. The staff also had symbolic value. It was a sign of leadership, but a leadership exercised in silence. Unlike a king with a crown or a warrior with a sword, the shepherd carried only the staff, and that was enough to show who was responsible for the flock. In a way, it reminds us of modern leaders who don't need to raise their voices or display positions of authority to inspire respect. A firm, discreet, and constant presence is enough. This instrument accompanied the shepherd at all hours during the day, to guide at night, for support or even defense. Each mark on the wood carried a story, perhaps a blow struck against an animal, or a fall avoided on slippery ground. The staff was almost a diary, like that personal object many carry for years, an antique watch, a favorite pen, or even a book that has seen different phases of life. Thus, the staff symbolized both care and power, protection and discipline. And it's curious how, amidst so many responsibilities, the shepherd's routine remained the same, repetitive, marked by a slow and steady rhythm. After all, his main task was simple, but required discipline, guiding the flock, day after day, in search of food and water. The shepherd would wake before the sun even rose, when the sky was still a deep, almost silent blue. The first sound of the day came from the bleating of the sheep, impatient to leave their makeshift enclosure. With calm steps, he would rise, adjust his cloak around his shoulders, and pick up his staff. The morning air was cool, but full of promise, and the scent of damp earth indicated that the day, though tiring, would be fertile. As the corral opened, the sheep filed out, one after the other, obeying habit more than haste. The sound of hooves on the hard ground created a monotonous cadence, almost like a slow drumbeat that set the pace for the beginning of the walk. The shepherd didn't rush the flock. He walked alongside, observing, checking to see if any of them limped or lagged behind. It was in this silent care that his true mission began. The search for pasture defined the course of the day. Sometimes it was a short journey, just a few minutes to reach a valley where the greenery still lingered. Other times, it could take hours under the scorching sun, crossing rocks and dust until finding a hill with some vegetation. This uncertainty was part of the shepherd's life, and perhaps his greatest lesson, not having absolute control over the results, only over the effort. Something that still challenges us today when we face good and bad days at work, with no guarantee of success. Water was another essential point. Finding a spring was like finding gold in the middle of the desert. The sound of running water, however faint, brought immediate relief to both the sheep and the man guiding them. Imagine the contrast. After hours of walking in the sun, feeling the coolness of the water touch your lips. This sensation, so simple, had the weight of a feast. It's curious how, today, we turn on a tap and rarely stop to give thanks. Once fed and satisfied, the sheep would spread out across the field, and the shepherd would assume his position of watch. He would sit on a rock, rest his chin on his staff, and observe. There was no rush, just waiting. The sound of bleating mingled with the buzzing of insects, creating a scene of absolute calm. It was in this slow pace that the shepherd reflected on life, on the stories of his ancestors, and on the promises that still guided his faith. And so the cycle repeated itself: morning, walk, pasture, water, watch. A simple, almost predictable routine, but vital for the herd and the people's survival. The curious thing is that behind this repetition, there was always an unexpected detail.
an animal straying, a new trail, a different sound. After all, however ordinary, each day brought its own surprise, and soon, as dusk fell, another inevitable challenge arose: managing water, that ever scarce resource. Water was undoubtedly the shepherd's most precious commodity. There was no tap to turn on, no bottle to carry on one's shoulder. Each drop was earned patiently. Sometimes, after long walks in the sun, the shepherd knew that without water, the flock would quickly weaken, and so his eyes were always alert to the horizon, searching for subtle signs: greener vegetation, the flight of birds, or even the distant sound that betrayed the presence of a spring. Wells were like hidden treasures in the desert. Some had been known and used for generations, others were discovered only by chance. A shepherd needed to know the region well to guide his sheep safely to these lifelines. It was common for entire families to depend on the same wells, which sometimes led to dispute. Imagine the value of something as simple as a bucket of water becoming a source of conflict. It was literally the difference between life and death. The scene of the flock arriving at a spring was almost always the same. The thirsty animals hurried forward, and the sound of dozens of mouths drinking echoed like music of relief. The shepherd, in that moment, felt not only satisfaction but also a fulfilled responsibility. It was as if he had given a vital gift to his flock. Today, it's curious to think about this when we see someone effortlessly open a cold bottle. Perhaps because we have so much access, we forget the true value of that which sustains life. There were also difficult days when water could not be found. At these times, desperation became palpable. The sun was beating down, the sheep bleated restlessly, and the shepherd carried on his shoulders the weight of a decision to persist in the search or retreat and risk losing the flock. This uncertainty was a constant shadow in his daily life. We can compare this to what we feel today when we search for solutions in the midst of personal or financial crises, unsure if the next step will be the right one. The smell of fresh water, when finally found, was unmistakable. It mingled with the aroma of wet clay and brought a sense of a promise fulfilled. For the shepherd, each sip was almost an answered prayer, and if we think about it, we still carry that same emotion today, albeit in a different form. Anyone who has ever felt thirsty on a trail or on a hot day knows how much a simple glass of water can seem more valuable than any luxury. Thus, water conservation wasn't just a routine part of life, it was the heart of desert survival. And when night fell, another concern became equally important: protecting the herd from the dangers lurking in the darkness. As the sun began to set behind the hills, the shepherd knew it was time to redouble his vigilance. The day might have been long, but night brought its own danger. The sheep were herded into makeshift pens, made of stacked stones or simple fences of dry branches. Nothing elaborate, but enough to keep the flock together and deter predators from approaching.
There, within that cramped space, a tense silence reigned, interrupted only by the soft bleating of the sheep as they settled in. The darkness in the fields was different from what we know today. There were no street lights, lanterns, or artificial lights flickering in the distance. Only the glow of the moon, when it appeared, and the shy twinkle of the stars. The shepherd had to trust his senses. Every rustle of a bush, every snap of a dry twig could be a sign of danger, and he remained alert, his staff always within reach, as if guarding an invisible but vital secret. At night, predators moved with greater courage. Wolves, jackals, and even human thieves prowled the flocks, looking for an opportunity. It was at these times that the shepherd became more than a caretaker, he became a guardian. Often he risked his own life to protect the sheep, and this, in a way, reveals a universal truth. A person's true worth emerges when they are willing to sacrifice themselves for what they guard.
Fire was also an ally. Small bonfires kept not only the cold at bay, but also the fear of wild animals. The smell of smoke mingling with the night air was a silent warning. There's surveillance here. Imagine the contrast today when we lock a door with modern locks and sleep without a care. Back then, a flickering fire was the safest lock a shepherd could offer his flock. The vigil routine was exhausting. Often the pastor slept only a few hours, his body propped up against a rock, his ear straining for any unusual sound. Fatigue was part of the job, and yet he held firm. It's like someone who, today, spends the night caring for a sick child or working a night shift. The body complains, but duty speaks louder. Thus, each night overcome was a silent victory. The flock awoke at dawn, safe, ready for another day of walking. But in the shepherd's heart, the solitude of these vigils left deep scars. After all, spending hours alone in the dark, torn between fear and hope, shaped not only his routine, but also his soul. Silence was perhaps the shepherd's most constant companion. He walked among the sheep, surveyed the surrounding valleys, and often had no one to exchange a single word with throughout the day. Solitude was part of the job, shaping his way of thinking and even his patience. It wasn't an empty silence, but a space filled with reflections, with thoughts that accumulated like stones along the path. There were times when the only sound was the tinkling of the bells attached to the sheep's necks, repetitive, almost hypnotic. This constant sound filled the empty hours, functioning as a kind of natural soundtrack. Today, we can compare it to the background music we play while working or studying, something that, without us realizing it, gives rhythm to our action. In the shepherd's case, the music was dictated by the flock itself. Loneliness was also an emotional test. Many men couldn't bear to spend so many hours alone, without the presence of others to talk to or share their worries. The shepherd, however, needed to find companionship in the little things: the wind, the rustling of leaves, the curious gaze of a sheep. This ability to see meaning in the simple is something we still lack today. How often do we seek digital distractions because we can't bear to be alone with our own thoughts? On the other hand, this absence of people also allowed for a profound intimacy with nature. The shepherd noticed details that others would never notice: the changing color of the clouds before a storm, the smell of the earth as rain approached, or even the strange behavior of animals that foretold danger. It was as if the silence amplified his senses, giving him a special connection with the world around him. This loneliness, however, could be heavy. There were nights when, sitting by the fire, the shepherd would gaze at the stars and miss a friendly voice. Perhaps he would think of distant family members or stories told around the table, memories that now turned to longing. And yet, this longing was mixed with a strange sense of purpose. He was alone, but not without reason. Deep down, the shepherd's solitude was like a silent school. It taught resilience, taught him to listen more than he spoke, and demonstrated the value of presence when finally someone appeared. And perhaps it was precisely this solitude that made him so attentive to his flock, as each sheep became his companion. But however patient he was, there was always a challenge. The sheep were fragile, and their vulnerability required constant care. The sheep, though numerous, were as fragile as children in an open yard. All it took was a careless move, and one of them would wander away from the group, attracted by a distant bush or a curious sound. The attentive shepherd had to count and recount the flock several times a day. Losing a single sheep wasn't just a failure, but a real risk to the animal's life. Isolation in such hostile lands almost always meant an inevitable end. These animals possessed a striking ingenuity. They walked without noticing holes in the ground, loose rocks, or steep slopes. Often the shepherd had to rush to rescue one of them before it hurt itself. It's curious how this vulnerability also affects human beings. How often do we remain distracted, overcome by small temptations, only realizing the danger when we're about to fall? Constant attention, both for them and for ourselves, is a daily exercise.
Danger came not only from the terrain, but also from predators. Wolves, jackals, and even lions prowled the valleys, looking for an opportunity. A lone sheep, far from the group, was an invitation to attack. Therefore, the shepherd had to place himself between the hunter and the prey, risking his own safety. This courage, often silent, shows how much responsibility for something fragile requires strength of spirit. When we observe sheep, we understand that their greatest weakness was also their greatest lesson. They taught the value of dependence. They needed the shepherd. They needed the group. They needed protection. Alone, they couldn't survive. Today, even in a world that values independence so much, we still carry this truth. No one survives in isolation. Whether in family, friendships, or work, we need each other to face modern predators, loneliness, stress, uncertainty. Interestingly, this vulnerability created bonds. The shepherd came to know each sheep, knowing which were the most distracted, which were frequently lost, which were more docile or more skittish. This knowledge came from daily interaction, from attentive observation, from the patience to always correct the same mistakes. It's like a teacher who learns to identify each student's difficulties, or a parent who recognizes their children's quirks. Weakness in this case brought them closer, and while the sheep were fragile and defenseless, this very fragility attracted constant enemies. The fields were filled with sounds that reminded the shepherd, beyond the holes and slopes, there were hungry eyes watching from afar, ready to pounce at any carelessness. As night fell over the hills, the sounds changed. The bleating of sheep faded, and in its place were denser noises, the snap of a twig, the scrape of something heavy against the vegetation, a distant roar that sent shivers down the spine of even the most seasoned shepherd. Among the dangers, lions, bears, and jackals topped the list. These weren't just stories told to scare, they were real presences, prowling, waiting for a careless moment to pounce. Lions, rare but feared, symbolized absolute danger. A shepherd knew that if a lion appeared, the fight would be unequal. Yet, there are accounts of men who faced these animals to protect their flock. The instinct for self-defense, combined with a staff or a sling, transformed the shepherd into an improvised warrior. Today, we don't face flesh and blood lions, but we have our own predators. Debts, illness, worries that seem greater than us. The courage required is the same. The bears posed another challenge. Strong and unpredictable, they attacked brutally. A hungry bear didn't distinguish between man and beast, and the shepherd needed to act quickly. Imagine yourself alone, without firearms, with only a piece of wood and stones within reach, facing a massive creature. It is in this contrast that we understand the magnitude of the responsibility that fell upon those men. Fear wasn't optional, but facing it was inevitable. Jackals, on the other hand, posed a more subtle but equally constant threat. They acted in groups, attacking stealthily, always targeting the weakest or most isolated sheep. They were a lesser threat than a lion, but precisely for that reason, the shepherd needed to be constantly alert, as if attending to seemingly small details that could become major problems if ignored. It's the same with our lives. Sometimes it's not the greatest tragedy that brings us down, but the accumulation of small distractions. The struggle against these animals was not only physical, but also psychological. The shepherd lived in a constant state of alert, training his senses to identify any strange movement. The predator's keen sense of smell was challenged by the man's keen attention. The struggle was silent but constant. Both fought for survival, and any hesitation was costly. And given this scenario, it becomes clear that the staff was not just a support, but a weapon and a symbol of resistance. But beyond the staff, there were other resources to endure the monotony and dangers of the journey. Simple music, played on flutes which served both to calm the sheep and to distract the shepherd's lonely heart. Amidst so much solitude, there was a sound that broke the monotony. The shepherd's flute, made of cane or simple wood. It was unadorned, but it carried a special function. When the flock stirred, restless from the wind or distant noises, the shepherd's gentle breath created a slow melody that seemed to lull the sheep. It was as if each note were an invitation to rest, to quiet, a reminder that someone was watching over. These songs were not rehearsed, nor did they follow sheet music. They were improvisations, born of the moment, of the pastor's mood, and of the surrounding environment. Sometimes the sound was joyful and light, like the rustling of leaves in a breeze. Other times it was deep and drawn out, echoing the longing of an absent voice. Anyone who has heard a simple melody on a guitar or even a spontaneous whistle understands the power of these notes to transform a space. Interestingly, the flute served not only to calm the flock, but also the shepherd himself. Amidst the silence, music provided companionship, a dialogue with oneself. Each breath filled the empty hours, helped endure the night's vigil, and gave rhythm to the day's walk. Today, we have playlists, radios, and apps to distract us. But deep down, the need is the same, to transform silence into companionship. Some accounts indicate that sheep learned to recognize the specific sound of their shepherd's flute. It was as if the melody created an invisible bond between them, a private code of trust. This detail reminds us of something we still experience: the importance of recognizing familiar voices amidst the noise of the world. Just as a child distinguishes its mother's call in a crowd, the flock knew that this music signified safety. Beyond its practical function, music also had symbolic value. It demonstrated that even in a profession marked by hardship and danger, there was room for beauty. The shepherd was not only a watchman, but also an artist of his own routine. He transformed the breath of air into notes that echoed through the valley, as if to affirm that even in the simplest life, there is room for poetry. And if music softened the loneliness, there was another skill equally essential for those who lived in the countryside: a deep understanding of the terrain, the trails, the valleys, and every detail that could mean danger or refuge. The shepherd didn't walk at random. His every step was guided by a memory built over the years, an invisible cartography etched in his mind. He knew which trails were safe, which rocks tended to loosen under the sheep's hooves, and where there was enough shade to rest in the middle of the afternoon. This knowledge didn't come from books, but from daily repetition, from attentive observation, from experience passed down from father to son. The trails became familiar, almost like old acquaintances. There was the narrow shortcut between two hills, which shortened hours of walking, the valley where the grass was greenest after the rain, and even that point where the wind blew strongest, bringing the scent of water. It was a living map, updated daily. Today, we rely on GPS apps to guide us through complex cities, But back then, the guide was human memory itself. This knowledge, however, wasn't limited to the trails. The shepherd could recognize signs invisible to others, the type of stone that indicated the proximity of a stream, the behavior of birds that announced food nearby, even the subtle change in the color of leaves that indicated different seasons. It's curious how in the past the senses were tools of survival, while today we outsource them to machines. The flock depended entirely on this wisdom. A wrong route could mean hunger, thirst, or even an ambush by predator. The responsibility was heavy, but the shepherd learned to carry this burden calmly. It's similar to a bus driver who knows every curve in the road, or a surgeon who knows exactly where to place the scalpel. The lives of many depend on the safety of just one. This trust wasn't learned overnight, but built over years of practice. The terrain also had its pitfalls. Seemingly safe trails could become traps after rain when mud made the ground slippery. Rocks that seemed sturdy suddenly crumbled. The shepherd needed to be prepared for the unexpected, creating alternatives in his mind. This kind of attention is something we can still apply today, knowing where we are, but also always having a second route in mind, whether on trips, projects, or even in life plan. So, this knowledge of the terrain became an extension of the shepherd himself. He was at once guide and guardian of the, but as much as he knew every detail of the land, there was something that required even more preparation, the constant need to move the flock according to the seasons, in search of seasonal pastures that would guarantee survival. The shepherd's life was not static. When the seasons changed, he had to change with them. Transhumance, as we call it today, was the natural movement of leading the flock in search of new pastures, suited to the climate of each season. In summer, the valleys dried out, and the shepherd led the sheep to higher ground, where there was still greenery. In winter, he descended again, seeking refuge from the cold. This rhythm marked time, almost like a living calendar. With each move, there was a sense of farewell. The shepherd left behind a familiar valley, with its familiar stones and memorized shadows, and ventured into new, uncertain lands. The sheep followed in line, trusting in the steps of their God. This routine of change was not only a necessity, but also a life lesson. Nothing is permanent, and adaptation is an essential part of survival. The journeys were long and tiring. Hours of walking in the sun or days of intense cold tested the shepherd's patience and tested the flock's endurance. At each transition, challenges arose, finding new water sources, dealing with unfamiliar predators, and navigating dangerous terrain. But there were also rewards: the sight of fresh pastures, the sense of accomplishment, the relief of seeing the sheep grazing peacefully again. Today, transhumance can be compared to our own routine changes. How many times do we need to change jobs, cities, or even habits to continue thriving? Like the shepherd, we are forced to abandon our comfort zones and seek new places that sustain our growth. And like him, we carry with us the memory of where we've been and the hope of what we'll yet find. This seasonal movement also created a connection with time that few recognize today. The shepherd didn't measure the year by months, but by the changes in the earth, the wind that heralded autumn, the snow that marked winter, the blossoming of green in spring. The flock, without realizing it, also followed this rhythm, teaching them that life is made of cycles, of comings and goings, of losses and renewals. And if transhumans showed how to deal with time and its changes, there was still another fundamental aspect of the shepherd's life: making the most of the fruits of the flock, especially milk and wool, which transformed into sustenance and wealth for the entire community. The flock was not only a symbol of wealth, but a constant source of sustenance. The sheep's milk was harvested daily,
transformed into simple yet nutritious cheeses that fed entire families. The shepherd saw in this food not only immediate satiety, but also the security of knowing that, even in difficult times, there was something to put on the table. Its rustic flavor, mingled with the scent of the smoke from the fire that warmed him, always reminded him that the essential could be simple. Wool, in turn, was almost an everyday miracle. From the soft fur clothes, cloaks, and blankets emerged that protected against the biting cold of the desert nights. There were no large, sophisticated looms, but skilled hands that spun and wove patiently. The shepherd knew that each shearing represented months of comfort for his family, and even currency with other communities. It was like harvesting invisible fruits from animals that, besides providing companionship, were a source of life. This dual value, milk and wool, transformed the flock into something deeper than mere possession. It was a long-term investment, a renewable resource that sustained generations. Imagine someone today who owns a small business or a piece of fertile land. Constant care brings continuous returns, not immediate, but lasting. This was the case with sheep, which year after year continued to offer the best they had. Trade arose from this. Shepherds exchanged wool for grain, milk for olive oil, cheese for tools. Every piece of spun wool was an opportunity for connection between peoples, and every jug of milk transformed into cheese was more than food. It was a form of relationship. The economy of the time pulsed quietly around simple exchanges based on real needs, very different from today's complexity. Yet there was a practical beauty in all of this. What for some was merely routine, for the shepherd was a cycle of gratitude: shearing, spinning, weaving, dressing, milking, boiling, curing, feeding. Each step had meaning, and no part was wasted. Perhaps this is one of the greatest contrasts with our time, where so much is thoughtlessly discarded. For them, every drop of milk and every thread of wool was too precious to be ignored. And if milk and wool were such a vital part of survival, there was also another destiny for sheep, more solemn and symbolic: their presence in religious rituals and sacrifices, which profoundly marked the spirituality of the people. The shepherd knew that his sheep were not just a source of food and wool. Often they had an even more solemn destiny: religious sacrifices. In the Old Testament, the sheep was seen as a symbol of purity and surrender. When one was brought to the altar, it was not just an animal but a profound gesture, representing the forgiveness, gratitude, or devotion of an entire people. It was a serious act, shrouded in silence, the scent of smoke, and reverence. The rituals carried a collective weight. Each family, by offering a sheep, participated in something greater than themselves. The spilled blood symbolized renewal, a new beginning, as if the animal's life gave way to hope. It's curious to think how, today, we still seek similar symbols. We don't offer sheep, but we make vows, light candles, and keep promises. The essence is the same, translating faith into visible gestures. For the shepherd, offering a sheep for sacrifice was bittersweet. On the one hand, there was pride in offering the best of his flock, proof of his devotion. On the other, there was the painful detachment, the farewell to an animal he had raised, protected, and accompanied since birth. This tension between giving and losing is a universal experience. To this day, every time we give up something precious for a greater cause, we feel the same mixture of pain and meaning. Ceremonies also marked time and memory. Feast dates and celebrations were linked to the sacrifice of sheep. The smell of burning flesh mingled with the sound of prayers and chants, creating an unforgettable atmosphere. For those who participated, it was impossible to separate faith from the sensory experience. Eyes, ears, and nose were touched simultaneously.
This union between body and spirit reinforced the intensity of the practice. The curious thing is that even though it was a repeated act, it never lost its symbolic value. Each new sacrifice seemed to renew the people's confidence that they were in communion with God. The pastor, albeit silently,
participated in this cycle. He knew that his daily work nourished not only bodies but also the community's spirituality. It was a reminder that the ordinary and the sacred could walk side by side, and in this intertwining of routine and faith, a symbol was also born that has spanned generations. The image of the shepherd as guide, as protector, as someone who, like his sheep, reflected the people's own relationship with the divine. The figure of the shepherd transcended the physical realm and gained ground in the spiritual realm. He was not just a man guiding sheep, but a reflection of divine. His patience, vigilance, and his act of protecting the weak and seeking out the lost made him a living metaphor for spiritual leadership. People saw in the shepherd an image that pointed to something greater, the idea that just as the sheep needed him, the people needed a guide. This symbolism became even stronger when one realized the pastor's silent dedication. He didn't expect applause or public recognition. His work was done in silence, away from the crowds. Likewise, faith is often built intimately, hidden in what no one sees. It's like the roots of a tree, invisible, yet essential to sustaining everything above ground. It's no coincidence that throughout the scriptures, God is described as a shepherd. The image was clear to anyone at that time. Just as a shepherd knows his sheep, so too does the Creator know each person. This parallel brought comfort because everyone knew the vulnerability of the sheep. Recognizing oneself as fragile was not a cause for shame, but the key to experiencing divine care. This insight still resonates today in our daily insecurities. The symbolism also taught about leadership. A good shepherd doesn't lead by shouting, but by presence. He guides from the front, not pushing from behind. It's the difference between an authoritarian boss and an inspiring leader. To this day, people can tell who leads by example and who merely demands things from others. The figure of the shepherd then became a practical lesson in how to exercise authority with love. This almost maternal care showed that being a leader wasn't about accumulating titles, but about making oneself available. The pastor bore the marks of sacrifice on his body: sleepless nights, injured feet, sunburned skin. But all of this made sense because his mission wasn't about himself, but about those who depended on him. How many modern leaders could learn from this simplicity? How many of us could also apply it to caring for our own families? Thus, the spiritual symbolism of the shepherd spanned generations, transforming a simple routine into an eternal metaphor. And it was no coincidence that so many important figures in biblical history began in this very profession, as if it were silent training for something much greater. Before becoming great figures, Jacob, Moses, and David were mere shepherds. The staff in their hands and the flock around them were their first teachers before history placed them in palaces or at war. Jacob, for example, spent years tending his father-in-law's sheep, enduring cold nights and scorching hot days. It was in this seemingly ordinary setting that he learned patience, perseverance, and even deceiving and being deceived. The field was his first battlefield. Moses, before becoming a liberator, also walked among the sheep. In the Midian desert, far from the grandeur of Egypt, he experienced the simple life of a shepherd. There, far from the crowds and privileges of the court, he learned to listen to the silence, to respect the cycles of nature, to guide without haste. It was in this environment of solitude and shepherding that he had his encounter with the burning bush, a turning point in his life. The desert prepared him more than any Egyptian school. David, perhaps the most remembered among them, found the foundation of his courage in his life as a shepherd. He faced lions and bears to protect his flock, risking his own life. The staff and sling he used against predators later became symbolic weapons against giants and enemies. The field taught him that to win great battles, One must first win the small ones, the ones no one saw. These stories reveal a curious pattern. Before greatness came routine, before recognition came loneliness. The greatest leaders first learned to care for the small, the fragile, the defenseless. It's as if true leadership could only be born in the anonymity of service. Today, when so many desire positions and titles without going through the process, they forget that even patriarchs were trained in the simplest tasks. The field, the flock, and solitude were the school of giants. Jacob learned about hard work, Moses about silence and revelation, David about courage and faith. Each took what they had learned among the sheep into their own lives, and perhaps this is a reminder for all of us. Seemingly small experiences are the ones that shape our character for great challenges. And if these men found their preparation in flocks, it is not surprising that even the most serious conflicts of the time also involved herding. After all, disputing land and water was as common as guiding sheep in search of food. The shepherd's life wasn't all about quiet routine. Often the silence of the fields was shattered by fierce disputes over precious resources, fertile land and clean water. In arid regions, a valley with green grass or a full well meant survival. It wasn't uncommon for families and entire tribes to find themselves in tension, defending their land. And so herding, so seemingly simple, could become the scene of lasting conflicts. Ancient accounts show that even patriarchs like Abraham faced this kind of situation. Their shepherds argued with Lot's shepherds because the land wasn't enough for both of them. This scene was repeated in different generations. Men armed with staffs and stones, debating who had rights to a well or a plain. Today, this may seem distant to us, but it's not so different from modern disputes over resources, such as oil, running water, or even urban spaces. Interestingly, these conflicts weren't driven solely by immediate need. Pride was also involved. Giving up a piece of land or giving up a well seemed like weakness. Therefore, arguments often dragged on, even when alternatives were available. This dynamic reminds us of how, even today, so many fights arise not over the resource itself, but over the symbol it carries: status, dominance, power. The shepherd, in the midst of all this, also became a negotiator. It wasn't enough to guide the flock. He needed wisdom in dealing with neighbors. There were hours of conversation, fragile agreements, promises that weren't always kept, and each decision could impact not only his family, but the entire future of his community. Thus, the staff served both to defend the flock and to be present in difficult discussions. These disputes shaped the social geography of the time. Where there were wells, villages sprang up. Where there were rivers, borders emerged. Water and pasture defined who prospered and who had to leave. And amid this constant dance of conquests and losses, the shepherds learned that life was also about negotiation, a delicate balance between maintaining peace and ensuring survival. And while these tensions were part of collective life, the shepherd's daily life continued at its repetitive pace. After each conflict was resolved or avoided, he returned to the silent work of counting his sheep, a monotonous but indispensable task to avoid losses amid uncertainty. Among so many responsibilities, there was one that seemed simple, but required almost infinite patience: counting the flock. At dawn, before leaving, and at dusk, before closing the corral, the shepherd would carefully look over each sheep. 1, 2, 3. The process continued until all were identified. It was repetitive, monotonous, but vital. All it took was one missing sheep for the routine to be interrupted and the search to begin. This repetition was almost like a ritual. The bleating of the sheep mingled with the sound of their own thoughts, creating a cadence that repeated itself day after day. Today, many would find it tedious, But there was a hidden wisdom in this practice. The detail, the meticulous checking, taught discipline. It's similar to reviewing your accounts daily, organizing your schedule, or checking that your doors are locked before bed. These are small gestures that prevent major losses. The curious thing is that the shepherd learned to recognize each sheep individually. To the outside observer, they all looked the same, but to him, there were subtle differences. A spot on the fur, a drooping ear, a way of walking. This attentive gaze transformed the act of counting into something more human, almost personal. It was like teachers who know each student by name, or parents who can accurately distinguish their children's cries. Repetition also revealed another lesson, the importance of constant. There wasn't always excitement or novelty. Often, it was just the same gesture, day after day, and yet it was in this repeated gesture that security was built. In modern times, we can apply this to the habit of saving small amounts, exercising every day, studying a little each night. Progress comes not from haste, but from silent repetition. For the shepherd, each count was also a reminder of his own responsibility. The flock wasn't just a faceless crowd, but a collection of lives for which he was responsible. Every mistake weighed heavily, every oversight left scars, and it's the same with us. In the simple tasks of everyday life, we often decide the course of great results without realizing it. And if counting the flock was essential to ensure that no sheep got lost, there was still another important detail identifying who each animal belonged to, especially when the shepherds met and the flocks mixed. When flocks of different shepherds encountered each other, confusion was inevitable. From a distance, all the sheep looked the same, white, woolly, and walking at a similar pace. To avoid loss and arguments, it was necessary to identify each animal. The shepherd then used simple but effective signs: a specific cut on the ear, a mark made with natural dye, or even a dyed wool thread tied to a paw. Small details that served as silent signatures. These markings had value beyond practicality. They were symbols of belonging. Each sign said, "This sheep has an owner. It's part of a specific flock." It's similar to what we do today when we put labels on objects, engrave initials on wedding rings, or even personalize cell phones with unique cases. They are ways of declaring identity amidst the crowd, of affirming that something or someone isn't lost in anonymity.
The shepherd also recognized his sheep by their trained eyes. It wasn't just physical markings, but also habits and behaviors. He knew which animal was more restless, which always strayed from the group, which stayed close to the water. This intimate knowledge reinforced the idea that care isn't just about keeping them together, but also about distinguishing, just as a teacher distinguishes talents among students, or a parent identifies different personalities among children. The signs, however, weren't just for the owner, they also served as a warning to others. Finding a marked sheep in the field meant immediately recognizing who to return it to. This reduced conflicts, maintained coexistence agreements, and strengthened trust between communities. It was a silent code that replaced documents or contracts. It's curious to note how even today we use logos, coats of arms, and trademarks to fulfill the same function. These practices remind us that identity is a form of protection. A sheep without a brand was more vulnerable to disputes or even theft. Likewise, a person without clarity about who they are runs the risk of getting lost amid the pressures of the world. The brand was not only a sign of possession, but also of belonging, of group security. And while signals helped distinguish one flock from another, there were times when the shepherd needed additional help to maintain order. On certain occasions, he relied on a four-legged ally, dogs. which, although rare at the time, could be trained to assist in herding. Although not common in all regions, some shepherds relied on trained dogs to help guard their flock. These attentive and faithful animals became extensions of the shepherd's eyes and ears. A whistle or a hand gesture was all it took, and the dog would rush to organize the sheep, prevent them from straying, or even scare away small predators. Their presence brought an extra sense of security, as if the shepherd had gained a tireless companion amidst the silence of the countryside. The bond between man and dog was born from daily coexistence. They slept side by side, shared scraps of food, and on many cold nights, even shared body heat. There were no fancy collars or commercially available food. There was only simple trust, built through looks and action. This partnership is something that still moves us today. Anyone who has ever had a dog knows that a dog doesn't need words to demonstrate loyalty. The dog also added rhythm to the routine. While the shepherd walked slowly, watching from afar, the dog ran in circles, barking when necessary, pushing the flock back onto the right path. It was as if his energy balanced the shepherd's calm, forming a perfect pair, one attentive to silent details, the other agile to act quickly. This complementarity reveals how we often need allies other than ourselves to maintain order in our own lives. Even so, the use of dogs was rare. In the Old Testament, recorded more in a few local traditions than as a widespread practice. Most shepherds relied solely on their staff and their own vigilance. This shows us that dependence on tools or auxiliary animals was not absolute. The true focus of the work continued to be human dedication. The dog was a bonus, not the basis of care. Even so, when present, he became almost part of the family. There were shepherds who spoke to their dogs as if they were people, telling stories, sharing thoughts, filling their loneliness. This intimacy shows how, throughout history, humans have always sought companionship and cooperation to face life's hardships. The dog, faithful and attentive, responded with loyalty. And while some had the privilege of having dogs, most relied on another equally powerful strategy: teaching their children to participate in the profession from an early age, ensuring that the wisdom of herding would never be lost from generation to generation. From a very early age, children were introduced to the craft of shepherding. There were no classrooms with neatly lined desks, nor books with colorful letters. The field was the school, and the father was the teacher. With small steps, the little ones followed the flock, observing the shepherd's every gesture, how he used his staff, how he recognized a lost sheep, how he read the signs of the weather. The learning was not theoretical. It was practical, shaped by the sweat and dust of the path. This early education had a clear objective: to prepare the new generation for responsibility. A child who started out helping watch the lambs soon learned to count the flock, fetch water, and watch the corral at night. Each task was a stepping stone, each challenge a training ground for adulthood. Today, it may seem harsh to imagine a childhood so tied to work, but there was also a sense of belonging. The child knew his efforts were vital to the family. The curious thing is that, in this process, not only technique was taught, the child learned value. Patience, attention, courage, and care were transmitted through daily example. The boy who saw his father face a predator understood what protection was. The girl who helped spin wool understood the value of continuous work. It was a silent but profound school, much more effective than long abstract explanations. This lesson reminds us of something that remains true today. Children observe more than they listen. They may forget words, But they never forget action. Just as the little shepherd imitated his father's way of guiding the flock, our children imitate how we deal with difficulties, how we treat others, how we react to the unexpected. The field taught us without speeches, only through the repetition of life. There were also moments of tenderness. The father would let the child hold the staff, even taller than she was, just to feel the weight of responsibility. The shy smile, the awkward effort, were part of the lesson. Perfection wasn't demanded, but consistency. It's like teaching someone to ride a bike. No matter how many times they fall, the important thing is to keep going until they find their balance. The field was, in this sense, the great bicycle of life. And so, between stumbles and discoveries, the children inherited not only the work, but also the soul of the trade. They grew up with the dust on their feet and the sound of sheep in their ears, forging an identity that would prepare them for a lifetime. But not everyone lived this itinerant rhythm. Some shepherds led their families to an even more nomadic life, erecting tents and moving from place to place as the flock needed them. The shepherd's life rarely had a fixed address. Families pitched their tents in one place, remained there as long as there was pasture and water, and then moved on. The house was not made of stone, but of cloth. The bed was not made of wood, but of mats on the floor. This nomadic routine taught detachment. Nothing was permanent, and home was where the family gathered. For them, the walls were movable, and the roof could be dismantled in a few hours. This mobility brought a different kind of freedom. While villages grew around cities, shepherds followed the winds, the seasons, and the animals. They lived as permanent travelers, carrying only what was necessary. Today, we could compare them to people who live in motorhomes or work remotely, constantly moving from city to city. The lifestyle is unusual, but it holds a unique charm. The world becomes home, and each place offers new landscapes. However, being a nomad also meant facing insecurities. There were no guarantees of stability, nor certainty of permanence. With each move, they had to adapt to different neighbors, face new dangers, and learn about unfamiliar lands. It was a lifestyle that tested the family's resilience, and at the same time, it created admirable flexibility. If they were in the valley today, they could be in the mountains tomorrow. The tents themselves were symbols of this lifestyle. Made of hides or heavy fabrics, they were easy to assemble and disassemble. There, everyone lived together in a small space, sharing not only meals but also stories, fears, and dreams. The warmth of the fire at night warmed both bodies and conversations. Perhaps this is why family bonds between shepherds were so strong. Life on the move forced them to lean on each other. This way of life also shaped spiritual identity. Many biblical texts describe life as a tent, temporary, fleeting, something that stands up for a time and then is dismantled. The nomad learned, in practice, not to become too attached to what passed. With each new change, it became clear that what was essential was not the place, but the people and the faith that walked alongside. And while these families lived itinerant lives, far from the cities, there was an inevitable contrast. The relationship, not always easy, between the shepherds and those who lived in urban centers. When shepherds approached the cities, the contrast was immediate. In the bustling streets, filled with merchants and mingled voices, they were seen as overly simple, almost rustic people. Their rough woolen clothes, the smell of sheep permeating their bodies, and their direct way of speaking set them apart from those living behind stone walls. They were necessary to the economy, but rarely admired. They were at the bottom, supporting the system, but with no place at the top of the social hierarchy. The relationship was marked by a certain distance. The urban dwellers saw the shepherds as backward, unrefined, incapable of understanding the complexities of life within the walls. At the same time, the shepherds viewed the city dwellers with a mixture of strangeness and distrust. To them, living amidst so much noise and dependence seemed artificial. It was as if the two groups spoke different languages, even though they shared the same land. Still, trade created meeting points. Cities depended on the wool, milk, and meat provided by the herd. Without the shepherds, there was no warm clothing, no cheese, and no religious sacrifices. This veiled dependence created an irony. The very people who despised the shepherds were supported by them. It's similar to what happens today with invisible professions: drivers, farmers, street cleaners. Without them, life stops, but they rarely receive applause. There was also a clash of values. While the city dwellers sought to accumulate wealth and establish solid homes, the shepherds learned to live with what they could carry. This difference in mentality generated mutual distrust. For the shepherds, the city felt like a prison. For the city dwellers, nomadic life seemed precarious. Two worlds that intersected only when necessity arose. This distance helped shape the pastor's identity as outside. They were always between the land and the city, but never fully belonged to either. This marginal position, paradoxically, made them free. They were not dominated by urban customs, nor bound by the weight of local politics. Their lives followed a different rhythm, slower, closer to the land and silence. And while in the cities they were viewed with a certain disdain, in the countryside it was a different story. There their importance was evident, as the rural economy revolved around herds. Sheep were more than animals. They functioned as currency, sustaining survival and agreements between different groups. In the ancient world, metal coins were not yet common, and the value of things was measured differently. For shepherds, sheep served as a veritable currency. With them they could trade food, oil, tools, or even alliances between families. Each animal represented a tangible living piece of wealth that could multiply over time. It was like carrying a traveling safe through the fields, bleeding and requiring constant care. The exchange of sheep also carried symbolism. To trade one of them was to offer something that required years of care, nights of vigilance, and daily labor. Therefore, each exchange carried emotional weight, not just material. It's like when someone today decides to sell a house or a family heirloom. It's not just a possession, it's a part of their own history. Trading sheep was, therefore, an act of trust and surrender. Different values were attributed to each animal. Younger animals capable of producing more lambs were especially prized. The more robust ones, good for wool and meat, were also sought after. This variation is reminiscent of modern-day investments. Some yield quick returns, others are more long-lasting, and it's up to the owner to balance the herd like a financial portfolio. It's curious how the principles of economics were already present in the simple life of the countryside. These negotiations created bonds between communities. A family that received a sheep in exchange for olive oil knew that this gesture strengthened relationships. Agreements were not based solely on having, but on trust. It was a relational economy, closer to what we see today in small local businesses, where the word given is as valuable as the signed contract. The sheep in this case was more than a commodity. It was a bridge between people. Sheep were also used as payment for larger commitments, such as marriages, debts, or alliances between clans. Handing over part of the flock was a sign of responsibility and seriousness. The shepherd knew that by giving up some of his animals, he was investing not only in a financial agreement, but in a shared future. This social aspect of the exchange reinforced the importance of the flock far beyond the field. And if the economy revolved around these animals, culture also celebrated them. Sheep appeared in songs, metaphors, and poetic texts, especially in the Psalms, which extolled the shepherd's patient care and the flock's fragility. The shepherd's life wasn't confined to the hills and valleys. It has spanned generations in the form of poetry and song, especially in the Psalms. In these compositions, the shepherd appears as a symbol of patience and vigilance, someone who guides calmly and protects firmly. The words describe simple, everyday scenes: the flock following slowly, the rod that corrects, the staff that comforts, but they gain a spiritual and poetic weight that has spanned centuries. Psalm 23 is perhaps the best known example. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. The text transforms the image of the shepherd into a universal metaphor for care and provision. It's not hard to imagine David, a shepherd in his youth, remembering nights under the stars when he had to protect his sheep. He knew from experience what it meant to lead, defend, and calm a flock. His poetry came not from theory but from practice. These texts also reveal the value of detail. The simple act of leading the flock to still waters or green pastures became poetry. A life gained grandeur through words, as if each small gesture could teach us about trust, security, and hope. It's a lesson that still applies today. Even repetitive tasks can become inspiration if viewed with new eyes. Poetic imagery helped people identify with one another. Those living in that era immediately understood what it meant to be a sheep amidst danger or to have a caring shepherd. It was accessible language, translating the invisible into everyday scene. This resource remains relevant today. Good communicators still use simple stories to explain profound truths because they know that simplicity touches deeper than complex discourse. These passages also reinforce the importance of vigilance. The shepherd could not sleep deeply, for any carelessness would be costly. Likewise, the text reminded us that life demands constant attention, even to the smallest details. The flock was always at risk, but also always under care. This tension between fragility and protection became a powerful image of the human condition, and if poetry gave dignity to the profession, social reality still demonstrated the opposite. Many continued to view shepherds as men of little importance, despite depending on them for their livelihood. This contrast created a paradox: the spiritual grandeur of their image versus the social contempt of their role. There was a constant irony in the lives of shepherds. The more essential they were to survival, the less prestige they received. They provided food, wool, sacrifices, and even the basis of the local economy. But socially, they were seen as simple, almost invisible people. The townspeople looked down on them with a certain disdain, as if the smell of sheep clinging to their clothes were a sign of inferiority. And yet, all it took was a single shepherd missing for chaos to ensue. This contrast between necessity and contempt is not exclusive to that era. Even today, many fundamental professions are invisible: the street cleaner, the farmer, the bus driver. They all keep life running, but are rarely celebrated. The Old Testament shepherd was a reflection of this reality. Without him, the flock would be lost, and without the flock, the people would suffer. But his figure remained on the margins, recognized only in times of crisis. The humble routine reinforced this perception. While kings paraded on golden thrones and priests conducted ceremonies, the shepherd spent days under the sun, caring for animals that barely noticed his presence. It was a life of anonymity, of effort without applause. But it's curious, often true strength lies in that hidden place, far from the spotlight. It is in silence that what sustains the whole is built. Social disdain also had cultural roots. Living outside the city, intense, far from political discussions and bustling businesses, made the pastor seen as backward and unrefined.
But this same distance gave him something precious: independence. He was not controlled by city trends or intrigues. He lived at a different pace, a different logic, simpler and, in a way, freer. This tension between being essential and being despised shaped the pastor's character. They learned not to depend on external approval, but to find value in their own mission. It's like someone who works in silence, without immediate recognition, but who deep down knows the importance of what they do. This attitude of humility and perseverance has spanned generations and become a life lesson. And however devalued they were, the symbol of the shepherd survived, so much so that to this day his image remains associated with patience, care, and vigilance, a legacy that has transcended the fields and reached the spiritual and cultural world. Even after so many centuries, the figure of the shepherd has not disappeared. It lives on, crossing cultures and religions, as a universal symbol of care.
When someone mentions shepherd, even if they don't know the details of the Old Testament, their mind immediately conjures up the image of someone who guides, protects, and watches over others. This permanence shows that certain roles transcend time and become archetypes, engraved in humanity's collective memory. What was once a routine field routine has now become a metaphor for leaders. Political, religious, and family leaders still resort to the idea of the shepherd, someone who walks ahead, who sees danger first, who sacrifices himself for the good of the group. It's curious to see how a life of anonymity and effort gained such symbolic power. The man who slept outside became a beacon of care even in the most sophisticated societies. This symbol also endures because it speaks to what every human being needs: security. Just as sheep were fragile in the face of predators, we too feel vulnerable in the face of life's pressures, and the idea of having someone human or divine to guide, protect, and welcome us brings immediate comfort. That's why the image of the shepherd remains present in sacred texts, poems, songs, and even motivational speeches. Patience is also an essential part of this heritage. The shepherd knew how to wait. He waited for the rain. He waited for the grass to grow. He waited for the flock to calm down. This trait became an example of virtue. To this day, when someone faces challenges with serenity, we say they act like a good shepherd. It's not just a compliment, but an acknowledgement that patient care is more effective than haste. Surveillance completes this triad. The pastor couldn't completely relax. Risks were always lurking. This watchful, constant watch was transformed into a symbol of responsibility. Leaders who care for communities, parents who watch over their children, even professionals who protect precious information, all carry a bit of this legacy. The pastor ceased to be just a profession and became a mirror of greater responsibility. Thus, the staff that once guided sheep became an icon of leadership, humility, and dedication. The dust of the biblical fields became an eternal metaphor. And if we've seen how this image has survived the test of time, it's worth remembering that every story needs an initial invitation, an introduction, capable of capturing the listener and preparing them for the. And now, after exploring every detail of the lives of biblical shepherds, here's an invitation. What can you learn from them for your own life? Perhaps it's the patience to wait for the right time. Perhaps it's vigilance in the face of subtle danger, or even the courage to care for others even when no one notices. After all, how often do you feel like a fragile sheep amidst so many pressures? The big question is, will you continue living on autopilot? Or will you apply this knowledge to guide your own story? Think about it. Which areas of your life need more care? When do you need to act like a shepherd and not like a lost sheep? These questions can change the course of your future.
If this journey opened your mind and sparked new reflections, share what struck you most in the comments. I want to hear from you. What part of this simple routine most impacted your outlook on life? And of course, don't forget, subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell. That way you'll continue learning from me with each new story, how the past, no matter how boring it may seem, can transform your present.